The morning Willa Corwen decided to become someone else. She was already standing at the servants' entrance of her own home. The October air smelled of damp stone and wood smoke. It always had. The kitchen garden was still recognizable. The lavender row her mother had planted, the low stone wall where Willa had skinned her knees learning to climb at 7 years old, the iron boot scraper beside the step that had been there since before anyone could remember. But the door was no longer hers to open. She knocked. A woman answered. Stout, gray-haired, with the expression of someone who had decided long ago not to be surprised by anything the day might bring. She looked Willa over the way one inspects a piece of furniture, useful or not, serviceable or already damaged. "You'll be the new girl," she said. "Not a question." "Yes, ma'am. Willa Vale from Exeter." "I'm Mrs. Bartle, housekeeper." A pause that lasted exactly as long as was necessary. "You're younger than I expected. Come in." Willa stepped across the threshold of Corwen Hall for the first time in 6 months. The kitchen was different. The old copper pots had been replaced with newer ones. The long table where cook had rolled pastry now held someone else's provisions. The window over the sink had been reglazed, the old bubbled glass gone, and the light that came through it was cleaner and somehow worse because of it. Everything had been moved 2 inches to the left or 2 inches to the right until nothing was quite where memory insisted it should be. Willa set down her bag and kept her face entirely still. "His Grace dines at 8, Mrs. Bartle said, moving already toward the next task. "He takes breakfast alone. He does not like to be disturbed before noon unless the matter is urgent. You'll learn quickly what urgent means in this house, and I promise you, it means considerably less than new staff expect." She did not ask Willa if she understood. She assumed it. It had been 6 months since the letter arrived. Willa had been in Exeter, living in 2 furnished rooms on the top floor of a house on Southernhay, with what remained of her quarterly allowance and a solicitor's bill she was managing in installments. When her uncle Osric Corwen's man sent formal notice that the estate had been settled. Her father, Baron Corwen, had died in March, and in May, before Willa had been informed of anything at all, her uncle had produced documents. Debts, he said, extensive and long-standing debts, and the estate had been sold to satisfy them. By the time Willa's own solicitor, Mr. Foss, had reviewed the papers, the sale was already complete and registered. Corwen Hall belonged to Soren Drayford, Duke of Drayford. Mr. Foss had been kind and honest, which was the particular combination that made difficult truths land cleanly rather than sideways. Without evidence of fraud, he had said, "We cannot challenge the sale. If such evidence exists, it would most likely be among your father's private papers." Her father's private papers were in his study at Corwen Hall. And so here she was, a housemaid named Willa Vale, with a reference letter that Mr. Foss had, after considerable internal debate, agreed to sign as a genuine professional courtesy. She met the Duke on her first evening. She had not expected to. Her plan, such as it was, depended on remaining invisible for several days at least, learning the rhythms of the house before drawing any notice. She was carrying a tray of firewood to the upper corridor when the study door opened and Soren Drayford stepped out. He was taller than she had imagined from the deed papers and the newspaper notice she'd tracked down in the Exeter Public Library. He wore a dark coat but no cravat, clearly between things, neither dressed for the day nor fully at ease. He looked at her the way a man looks at something unexpected, not unkindly, but with the particular attention of someone whose habit it is to notice. "You're new," he said. "Yes, Your Grace, Willa Vale. I started this morning." He said nothing for a moment. He was not, she realized, looking at her uniform or her tray. He was looking at her face. "The study," he said, "is not on the route for firewood." Willa had taken a wrong turn, deliberately, to see the corridor, to see which door was his study, to understand the lay of the upper floor. It had not occurred to her that he might simply be standing on the other side of one of those doors at precisely the wrong moment. "I apologize, Your Grace. I don't know the house well yet." "No," he said, "you don't." He stepped aside. She passed him, found the correct corridor, delivered the firewood, and did not allow herself to look back. She lay awake that night in the small room she shared with Tess, the under-housemaid, listening to the wind come off the moor in the way it always had in October, that particular sound, low and continuous, that Willa had grown up thinking was simply what silence sounded like. She thought about the way he had said it, not a reprimand, not quite a warning, something more neutral and because of that more difficult to read. He had simply stated a fact: "You don't know this house." But she did. She knew every corner of it. That was the problem. The days settled into a pattern. Willa was careful. She did not linger in rooms she had no reason to be in. She did not ask questions that a new housemaid would have no cause to ask. She did not react when she passed the drawing room and saw her father's escritoire standing against the wrong wall, or when she found her mother's china in a cabinet she had not put it in. She learned from Mrs. Bartle, who taught through instruction, and from Tess, who taught through cheerful indiscretion. "His Grace keeps odd hours," Tess said one morning, polishing silver at the kitchen table. "Up before dawn some mornings. Mrs. Bartle says he was a naval officer before he inherited the title. He doesn't talk about it." "He doesn't talk about much," Willa said. "He's not unkind," Tess said, with the fairness of someone who has genuinely considered the question. "He's just closed. Like a house with all the shutters drawn. You know there's something inside. You just can't see it." Willa thought about that for longer than she intended to. She found the locked room on her fourth day. East wing, end of the corridor, a plain door older than the others, with a newer lock fitted to a keyhole that didn't quite match, no nameplate, no explanation. She tried the handle once, lightly, in passing, and found it secured. She did not try again. Not yet. What she found instead, sooner than she had expected, in a way she had not anticipated, was her mother. Mrs. Bartle had organized a general clearing of the attic to inventory what had come with the estate. Willa was carrying boxes toward the far end when she saw it, leaning against the angled wall beneath the eaves, her mother's portrait. The small, informal one, the one that had hung in her father's private sitting room. Her mother at 30, painted in three-quarter profile, smiling at something outside the frame. A blue ribbon in her hair, the same blue ribbon that Willa still had, folded in tissue paper at the bottom of her traveling bag, because she had not been able to leave it in the rented rooms in Exeter, because some things are not negotiable even when everything else is. Willa set down the box she was carrying. She stood in front of the portrait. She did not cry. She had done her crying in Exeter, alone in the two furnished rooms, in the weeks after she had understood the full shape of what her uncle had done. There was nothing left now but the particular ache of something that had been interrupted before it was finished. That came with the estate inventory. She turned. Soren Drayford was standing at the top of the attic stairs. He had not made any sound coming up. He was looking at her, not at the portrait. "She was beautiful," he said. "Do you know who she was?" Willa's hands were very still at her sides. "No, Your Grace." It was the first lie she had told him directly. The others had been lies of omission, or of framing, which she had been able to manage with something approaching equanimity. This one sat differently. "The previous family," he said, "a baron and his wife, both gone now. The house came to me through a sale that was—" He paused. Something moved across his face briefly, like cloud shadow crossing open ground. It was an unusual transaction. Unusual how? She should not have asked. A housemaid would not ask, but the words were already out. He looked at her with that same unhurried attention. "That," he said quietly, "is a very good question." He left without explaining. Willa remained in the attic a few minutes longer, her hand resting on the edge of the portrait frame, her thumb on the corner where the gilt had worn away. Then she picked up the box and went back to work. That evening, she found a note on the tray outside the study door, written in a neat, spare hand. "If you need time in the attic, take it." Nothing more, no signature, no explanation. She turned the paper over, nothing on the back. She began to understand that Soren Dreyford was a man who noticed more than he showed, and said less than he knew, and acted on the difference without any apparent need for acknowledgement. On the 9th day, Mrs. Bartle sent her to dust the corridor outside the locked east wing room. Willa was quite certain it was a test. Mrs. Bartle tested everyone, constantly, in small ways, watching how they responded to proximity to the things they were not supposed to touch. Willa dusted the corridor carefully. She did not try the handle. She studied the door. When she straightened up from the baseboard, the Duke was at the far end of the corridor. "Mrs. Bartle assigned you this section?" he asked. "Yes, Your Grace." He walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the door the way one looks at a problem that has been considered at length without resolution. "That room," he said, "is locked because I haven't yet decided what to do with what's inside it." Willa waited. "When I first took possession of the hall," he continued, "the men doing renovation work found a cavity in the wall. Inside were documents, letters, ledgers, sealed in oilcloth." He was quiet for a moment. "I had them examined by my own solicitor. He told me they pertain to the estate's financial history. He recommended I keep them secured while he completed an investigation." Something shifted in Willa's chest. Not hope exactly, but the thing that precedes hope, the small clearing before the feeling itself arrives. "What investigation?" she asked. The Duke looked at her directly. There was no performance in the look, no aristocratic composure deployed as distance. It was simply a man telling another person something true. "The sale of this estate was brought to me by a solicitor acting for a man named Osric Corwen," he said. "I was told the Baron had died in debt and that the estate was being liquidated by his only surviving heir." He paused. "What I was not told, until my own solicitor began asking questions that the other man had not asked, was that the Baron had a daughter, a legitimate daughter, who should, by any fair reading of the entailment, have been the primary consideration." The corridor was entirely quiet. "I purchased this house in good faith," Soren said. "But good faith does not make a thing right." Willa looked at him. She had spent 6 months constructing a version of this man in her mind, indifferent or careless, or simply too wealthy and too removed to trouble himself with questions about where things came from. She had needed that version. It had been easier to act against a man she had already decided was culpable. She had been wrong, and she was steady enough to know it. "Your Grace," she said, "my name is not Willa Vale." Something in his expression shifted, not surprise, but a quality of release, as though a calculation he had been holding had finally resolved. "I know," he said. "You know." "Your hands," he said. "The first morning you found the servants' staircase without anyone having shown you. And the way you stood at the kitchen garden when you arrived, there was a particular quality to that stillness." He paused. "I grew up in a house that had been in my family for 4 generations. I know what it looks like when a person is in a place they remember." Willa closed her eyes for one moment, just one. "Wilhelmina Corwen," she said when she opened them. "Willa, the Baron was my father." The Duke inclined his head, not in deference, but in the manner of a man receiving a confirmation he had already determined to take seriously. "Come," he said, "I'll open the room." Her father had wrapped the ledgers in oilcloth and set them carefully into the cavity, behind a false panel in the east wing wall. She recognized his handwriting the moment she opened the first ledger. That neat, deliberate hand, the columns that balanced to the penny, the record of a man who had understood money as a form of responsibility rather than a form of power. There was no debt of the size her uncle had claimed. There had never been. There were letters, too. Letters from Osric, written in the months when the Baron had grown ill, requesting access to the estate accounts. Her father's replies were courteous and entirely firm. He had refused at every stage. He had known, it appeared, what his brother intended. And at the bottom of the papers, wrapped separately, was a letter in her father's hand, addressed to Mr. Foss and never sent. It laid out everything: the false accounting Osric had begun constructing, the documents he had obtained through a solicitor of compromised integrity, the pattern of a man preparing to act the moment he could do so without opposition. Her father had written it in the weeks before he died. He had asked that Mr. Fossey act as Willa's legal protector in the event of his death. He had hidden it here instead of sending it because he had run out of time, or because he had known the post was not safe, or both. He had hidden it where it could be found by someone with reason to look. Willa sat on the floor of the East Wing room and read the letter twice. Her hands were steady. The steadiness cost her something, but she had accounts she was accustomed to paying. Soren sat in the single chair the room contained, at a distance that was respectful rather than remote. He did not speak. He did not look away. He simply remained. When she finished, she said, "He hid this here on purpose." "Yes," Soren said. "I think he trusted that whoever came into possession of the house, if they were honest, would find it and understand its significance." Willa looked up at him. And if someone dishonest had come instead, then it would have been found eventually regardless. He was quiet for a moment. Walls do not keep secrets past a certain point. It is only a question of who opens them. The legal proceedings took 8 weeks. Mr. Foss came up from Exeter, met at length with the Duke's solicitor, reviewed the documents, and sent correspondence to Osric Corwen's man that Willa was told was quite unambiguous in its conclusions. Osric did not contest the findings. He had, it emerged, already spent the majority of the sale proceeds. The Duke did not pursue him beyond what the law required. "You could have," Willa said one evening. They were in the library. She had stopped pretending 3 evenings ago that she was there to dust the shelves. The fire had burned down to a steady glow. Outside, the first snow of the season was crossing the moor in quiet, unhurried sheets. "Yes," the Duke said. He was looking at the fire, but a man who builds his life on a rotten foundation and is finally shown what it is, that tends to be sufficient. Adding to it rarely improves anything. You are more merciful than I am. You have more reason to be otherwise." He turned slightly. Being wronged tends to produce one of 2 things in a person: righteousness or clarity. You seem to have produced the second. Willa considered this. "My father was not a man who added to what was true," she said. "He wrote what was and hid it where it could be confirmed. Nothing more and nothing less." "Tell me about him," Soren said. So she did. She told him about the Baron of Corwen, who had read to her on winter evenings and taught her to play chess, and refused to let the estate fall into disrepair even in the lean years, because he believed a house was a kind of promise to everyone who lived in it. She told him about her mother, who had died when Willa was 14, and about the blue ribbon, and about the portrait in the attic. She told him about the lavender row in the kitchen garden and how she had counted the plants every summer and been quietly bereft when some did not come back in the spring. He listened with complete attention. At one point, when she described her father writing the letter he had not managed to send, she saw his jaw tighten. Once. Briefly. She recognized grief when it was being held by someone long accustomed to holding it alone. "Soren," she said, the first time she had used his name, and she said it before she had entirely decided to. It arrived, rather than being chosen. He looked at her. "Were you close with your family?" "My mother died when I was 12, he said. "My father when I was 19. I spent the years between serving in the Navy, which meant I was somewhere other than home for most of my adult life." A pause. "I have been, I think, considerably better at being purposeful than at being present." "And yet here you are," Willa said, "on a moor in Devonshire, investigating a land sale no one asked you to investigate." "I found documents in a wall," he said. "I am not suited to leaving things unresolved." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the shape one leaves behind. "It is a significant personal failing." Willa looked at the fire. She looked at the room. The shelves she had climbed as a child, the reading chair where her father had sat, the faded curtains that were exactly the blue they had always been. The room still knew her. She had not been able to change that in herself, no matter how carefully she had tried to arrive as a stranger. "The estate can be returned to you," Soren said. His voice was careful in the particular way she had come to recognize, even, measured, because he was being precise about something that cost him something. "Once the legal transfer is complete, Corwen Hall is yours, free and clear. I'll remove to London, or find somewhere else. Whatever compensation is owed will be managed between the solicitors." He paused. "You'll have what was taken from you." "Yes," she said. The snow pressed against the glass. The fire settled. Willa set down her book. She looked at Soren Dreyford, not as the Duke, not as the stranger who had bought her home, not as the obstacle she had invented in Exeter to keep herself angry enough to move. She looked at the man who had found her father's letter in a cavity in a wall and kept it carefully secured, who had tasked his own solicitor with asking questions no one had thought to ask, who had written, "If you need time in the attic, take it on a slip of paper," and left it without signature or expectation of reply, who had never once, in 9 days of watching her be someone she was not, made her feel small for the necessity of it. "What if I asked you to stay?" she said. The room was very quiet. Soren turned to look at her. His eyes were direct and without ornament, the way everything about him was direct and without ornament. "That would change things considerably," he said. "Yes," she said, "it would." Willa. It was the first time he had used her name, her real name, not the alias, not Miss Corwen, just Willa. It landed differently than she had expected, like a door opened rather than knocked upon. "Are you asking because the house requires a resident," he said carefully, "or because you want me to be in it?" "The second," she said, "since you asked for precision." Something moved in his expression, that interior shift she had caught before, only in small, unguarded moments, the thing that lived behind the stillness. It looked, she thought, like a room where someone had finally decided to open the shutters. He reached across the low table between them. He did not take her hand. He set his hand beside hers, close enough that the warmth of it was present and asking. Willa turned her hand over. Outside, snow settled over the kitchen garden, and over the lavender row, and over the low stone wall where a girl had once skinned her knees learning to climb. The fire held its light. The blue curtains kept the dark where the dark belonged. Corwen Hall was hers again. She had decided who would be in it with her. That, too, was hers. The decision, the choosing, the plain fact of being the one who got to say. Some things begin badly. A forged signature, a locked door, a servant's entrance taken under a borrowed name. They do not have to end where they begin. Where they end is a different matter entirely, and it had always, from the very first morning she had stood shivering at the kitchen step of her own home, belonged to her.